The gate did not care who wore the crown. On the white cliffs above the narrow sea, Dover Castle stood like a hard answer to a frightened question. Below it, the channel carried ships, rumors, reinforcements, and invasion threats. Behind it lay the road into England. Whoever held Dover did not merely hold a fortress. He held the lock on the kingdom's front door. By 1216, that mattered more than almost anything else in England. King John's reign had already turned poisonous. In 1215, under pressure from rebellious barons, he had sealed Magna Carta at Runnymede, not as a generous act of reform, but as a concession made under political force. The agreement did not heal the realm. It exposed how little trust remained between the king and the men who were supposed to obey him. Then the crisis widened. The rebel barons invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne. Louis crossed into England with French support, and for a time his campaign looked dangerously plausible. London accepted him. Powerful nobles backed him. John's authority, already damaged, seemed to be breaking apart in public, and in that moment, Dover became more than stone. It became a question. Could a kingdom survive if its castles chose sides? The answer depended not only on armies or royal seals, but on men inside walls. Men with keys, food stores, weapons, local knowledge, and the authority to open or close a gate. The king might issue commands from elsewhere. The castle commander had to decide what those commands were worth when siege engines arrived. At Dover, that man was Hubert de Burgh. He was not a mythical defender placed there by legend to make the story cleaner. He was a royal official, a soldier administrator, a man whose importance came from the very nature of medieval power. In a world where authority traveled slowly, where orders moved by horse, ship, parchment, messenger, and memory, the person physically holding a fortress could become more important than the person legally claiming it. This is why castles changed war. They made political loyalty physical. A promise could be broken. A treaty could be ignored. A noble could change sides. But a castle forced everyone to deal with a material fact. A ditch, a wall, a gatehouse, a store of grain, a defended stair, a room where keys hung from iron rings. If the garrison stayed loyal, the enemy had to pay for every yard. If the garrison wavered, the strongest wall in the kingdom could become a doorway for disaster. In the summer of 1216, Prince Louis's forces attacked Dover. The castle's outer defenses were damaged. Mining was used against the gate area. Men worked underground in darkness, scraping through chalk and earth, trying to make the fortress fail from beneath rather than break it from above. Above them, defenders listened for sounds that might mean collapse. Imagine the pressure inside the walls. Not a cinematic charge, not a clean duel between kings. A garrison living with the slow rhythm of siege. Footsteps on timber floors, damp wool, smoke from lamps, the sour smell of crowded men, the rationing of food, the fear that the next tremor under the gatehouse might be the beginning of the end. A guard on night watch would not need to understand the full politics of Magna Carta to know the danger. He would know the sound of tools below the ground. He would know the weight of a helmet after hours in cold air. He would know that outside the walls were men who wanted the castle, and inside the walls were men quietly measuring how long loyalty could last. That was the strange power of a medieval castle. It turned a national crisis into something painfully local. The fate of a realm could narrow until it depended on whether enough men in one place could stay fed, stay paid, Stay frightened of the right enemy, and stay convinced that surrender would cost more than endurance. For kings, this was both a miracle and a nightmare. A castle could preserve royal authority after a battlefield defeat. It could slow an invasion long enough for reinforcements to gather. It could protect a road, a harbor, a river crossing, or a rebellious frontier. It could make conquest expensive. It could make rebellion dangerous. But the same fortress also revealed the king's weakness, because a king did not personally hold every gate. He had to delegate. He had to trust castellans, sheriffs, nobles, captains, clerks, servants, masons, watchmen, and suppliers. He had to believe that men who slept behind his walls would still think of those walls as his property when the crisis came. That belief was never guaranteed. Across medieval Europe, castles multiplied because they solved an old problem: how to control land when central authority was fragile. A ruler could not be everywhere. A mounted army could ride through a district and leave. A written command could be ignored by someone far enough away. But a castle remained. It watched roads. It taxed movement. It sheltered armed men. It intimidated villages. It gave a lord presence even when the lord was absent. That is why castles were not just defensive buildings. They were instruments of occupation, administration, punishment, storage, display, and memory. They told the surrounding countryside that power had a permanent address. At Dover, this system worked in favor of the crown. Hubert de Burgh held out. Louis did not take the castle. The fortress remained a royal anchor during a moment when much of the kingdom seemed negotiable. Dover's resistance helped deny the French prince the clean victory he needed. But the deeper lesson was more unsettling than simple heroism. England did not survive merely because the king was strong. In 1216, John was a damaged ruler, widely distrusted, and soon dead. The kingdom survived because certain institutions, officials, loyalties, and fortified places did not collapse at the same time. That distinction matters. A medieval kingdom was not a single body obeying one brain. It was a network of promises, offices, lands, castles, families, debts, fears, and habits. When that network held, the king looked powerful. When it fractured, even a crowned ruler could find himself begging his own fortresses to remain loyal. Dover shows the central paradox of the medieval castle more clearly than almost any abstract explanation could. The stronger the castle, the more valuable the person holding it became. The more castles a kingdom built, the more its power depended on people who were not the king. That is why the medieval castle deserves to be understood not as a romantic ruin, but as a political machine. It could make a ruler seem untouchable from the outside, while quietly making him dependent on every commander, accountant, mason, sailor, and guard required to keep the walls alive. And long before gunpowder cracked towers apart, this was already the hidden weakness inside the fortress world. The wall could stop an army. It could not guarantee obedience. Before we move deeper into the stone system that shaped medieval Europe, remember Dover's lesson. History does not begin with ruins. It begins with structures that once worked exactly as intended. If you want more stories like this, where power is examined not as legend, but as a living system, subscribe and follow the next chapter. Because to understand how a castle could save a kingdom, we have to go back to the moment castles first arrived as instruments of conquest. Not in stone at first, but in timber, earth, fear, and forced labor. That road leads to 1066. The first Norman castles were not built to withstand history. They were built to make yesterday's owners understand that history had changed. After Hastings, England did not become Norman in a single afternoon. A battlefield could kill a king. It could scatter an army. It could open a road to London. But it could not, by itself, make thousands of villages accept new masters, new laws, new accents, new taxes, and new names attached to old land. William of Normandy had won the crown in 1066. Holding it was another problem entirely. The country he had taken was not empty. It had towns, churches, estates, local elites, memories of old kings, and families who understood the fields and roads better than any invading army could. The Norman victory had created a king, but not yet obedience. Between royal claim and daily control stood the stubborn geography of England. Rivers, markets, shires, roads, forests, and communities that could resist, delay, or simply wait for the invader to leave. William's answer was not only cavalry, it was construction. The early Norman castle was often a motte and bailey, an earth mound with a timber tower on top, attached to an enclosed courtyard protected by ditch and palisade. Compared with the later stone fortresses of the medieval imagination, these first castles could look almost crude. Earth, wood, mud, stakes, a raised mound, a fenced space for horses, soldiers, supplies, and administration. But crude does not mean weak. The genius of the motte and bailey was speed. It could be raised quickly, sometimes in places where the surrounding population had no desire to help, and precisely because it was fast, it answered the conqueror's first need. William did not need every castle to last for centuries. He needed them to dominate the next season, the next road, the next rebellion, the next tax collection. A stone castle announces permanence. A timber castle announces arrival. In the years after 1066, Norman fortifications appeared across England with extraordinary intensity. They rose near towns, river crossings, ports, old Roman roads, and strategic centers. Some were built inside or beside existing settlements. Others imposed themselves on the landscape like a foreign sentence written in earth. For the people nearby, the castle was not an abstract military innovation. It was a daily fact. Imagine a village not long after conquest. Men are ordered to dig. The ditch has to be cut deeper. Earth has to be carried upward in baskets. Timber has to be dragged into place. The work is wet, heavy, and watched. A Norman mounted man may not need to understand the local language to make the meaning clear. The old order is no longer defending this ground. The new order is building on top of it. The sound would not be heroic. Spades biting soil, axes cutting timber, oxen straining against ropes, mud sticking to wool, someone coughing in cold air, a church bell in the distance, still ringing for the same village, while the hill beside it is turned into something that did not belong to the village at all. This is where the medieval castle begins as a political tool. It was not only meant to resist attack from outside. It was meant to watch the people around it. The bailey could hold armed men, animals, stores, clerks, prisoners, and equipment. The tower on the motte gave height, visibility, and psychological advantage. A lord did not need to be beloved if his soldiers could see the road and reach the market before anyone else could organize resistance. That was what made the castle different from a passing army. An army moved, a castle stayed. A cavalry raid could terrify a district for a day. A fortress could remind the same district every morning that the conqueror had not gone home. It made occupation routine. It made fear local. It made the new regime visible from fields, paths, and rooftops. This mattered because Norman rule was thin at first. The invaders were a minority in a country they had seized. They could replace landholders, install loyal followers, seize estates, and punish rebellion. But they could not personally stand in every village. Castles helped solve that problem by concentrating authority in fortified points. From there, Norman lords could patrol, collect dues, shelter troops, and answer resistance without waiting for the king himself. Yet the solution carried its own danger from the beginning. Every castle strengthened conquest, but every castle also strengthened the man entrusted with it. A royal order became real only if the local lord, castellan, or garrison chose to enforce it. The king could distribute land and demand loyalty, but the practical grip on a region often rested with someone behind a ditch and palisade, surrounded by armed retainers and local fear. William understood the need for this system because conquest had no softer alternative. After Hastings, resistance did not vanish. There were rebellions in different parts of the country. The north, especially, remained dangerous. The Norman response could be brutal, and castles were part of that wider program of domination. They helped secure routes, intimidate centers of resistance, and hold areas that might otherwise slip back into revolt. A castle was therefore not just a military answer. It was an answer to distrust. The conqueror distrusted the conquered. The conquered distrusted the conqueror. Local communities distrusted new lords who spoke another language and claimed land through victory. Norman nobles distrusted one another because the prize was enormous, and ambition had not disappeared just because one duke became king. In that atmosphere, fortification became the grammar of politics. To hold land meant to fortify it. To command a town meant to overlook it. To claim a crossing meant to build beside it. To rule people who did not invite you meant to make refusal costly. This is why the early castle should not be imagined only as a defensive refuge. It was also an offensive structure, even when no battle was taking place. It projected force into the surrounding countryside. It allowed a small number of soldiers to dominate a larger civilian population. It turned conquest from a dramatic event into a permanent arrangement. The materials mattered. Wood and earth made the first stage possible. A motte could be thrown up faster than dressed stone could be quarried, cut, hauled, and raised. Timber palisades could be erected with local resources. Ditches could be dug by compelled labor. Speed gave William and his followers a weapon that did not require waiting for architecture to become beautiful. Later generations would romanticize castles as noble silhouettes against the sky. The first Norman generation used them more bluntly. They were not scenery, they were pressure. Still, even in this rougher phase, castles changed the mental map of England. A town with a castle was no longer the same town. A road watched by a garrison was no longer the same road. A market under the eye of a Norman lord was no longer merely a place of exchange. It had become a place where the new regime could count, tax, punish, and listen. The castle also changed time. For the conquered, it meant the invasion had not ended. For the conquerors, it meant the victory could be renewed every day without fighting another Hastings. For the king, it meant his authority could reach farther than his body. But that reach depended on intermediaries, builders, officers, garrisons, landholders, and men who might obey the crown today because obedience was profitable. There was no clean separation between security and domination. The same palisade that protected Norman soldiers also imprisoned the surrounding population inside a new political reality. The same ditch that stopped attackers also marked the boundary between those who commanded and those who were commanded. The same raised tower that watched for rebellion also reminded ordinary people that rebellion had become more dangerous than before. This was the Norman shock. Not simply that England had a new king, not simply that Anglo-Saxon elites lost land, not simply that French-speaking lords entered old estates. The deeper shock was that power became anchored in the landscape at speed. Where authority might once have felt like a distant court, it now stood above the village in timber and earth. And because the earliest castles were practical rather than elegant, they reveal the truth more clearly than the later ruins do. The castle began as a solution to fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of distance, fear of hostile towns, fear of old loyalties. Fear that a conquest won in battle might dissolve in the mud of local resistance. For a while, the answer worked. Across England, these fortifications helped the Normans turn victory into government. They gave the invaders places to sleep, store, threaten, retreat, and rule. They made the new aristocracy visible. They made the cost of defiance higher. But timber rots. Earth settles. Political fear does not disappear just because a palisade stands for one generation. As Norman rule hardened, the castles had to harden with it. The temporary mound was not enough. The wooden tower could burn. The palisade could be cut, undermined, or replaced. If conquest was going to become inheritance, if fear was going to become law, if the new rulers wanted their children to dominate the same roads and towns, then the architecture of control had to become more permanent. The next stage would rise in stone, and stone would change the psychology of power again. Stone did not make power eternal. It made fear harder to ignore. After the first shock of conquest, timber and earth had done their work. The Motte Bailey Castle was fast. It was useful. It could appear where a ruler needed control before the ground had fully accepted him. But speed came with limits. Wood could burn. Palisades could rot. Earthworks could slump after rain. A timber tower might dominate a village for a generation, but it did not carry the same message as masonry rising above a river, a road, or a town. The Normans and their successors understood this quickly. If conquest was going to become inheritance, then the architecture of conquest had to change. A wooden fort could say, "We are here." A stone keep said, "We intend to remain." That distinction mattered deeply in medieval politics. Power in the Middle Ages was not only enforced through armies. It was performed through visibility. A ruler needed people to see authority before they felt it directly. The tower on the hill, the keep above the market, the wall beside the bridge. These were not neutral shapes in the landscape. They were statements built at a scale ordinary people could not answer. A stone keep changed the emotional weather of a place. It stood above roofs. It looked down on streets. It controlled approaches. It made local resistance feel smaller before anyone had drawn a sword. Even when no garrison marched out, the structure itself was working. It was watching. It was measuring the town beneath it. It reminded the surrounding population that the new order had stopped being temporary. Rochester Castle shows this transformation clearly. The site mattered before the great stone tower rose there. Rochester sat by the River Medway, guarding a crossing on the road between London and the Channel coast. Whoever controlled that point had influence over movement, trade, military passage, and communication. In medieval England, roads and rivers were not just scenery, they were arteries of command. The early castle at Rochester was connected to the Norman settlement of power after 1066. Later, in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, its stone form gave that power a harder body. The Great Keep, associated with the period of Bishop Gundulf and later royal authority under Henry I, became one of the most imposing examples of castle architecture in England. It was not merely tall, it was deliberate. Stone keeps used thickness, height, narrow access, internal stairs, controlled chambers, and defensive openings to make approach difficult and command visible. A visitor entering such a place did not simply walk into a building. He passed through layers of meaning: gate, wall, stair, hall, chamber, lordship. Every step inward was a reminder that authority had designed the route. Inside, the keep served multiple purposes. It could shelter the lord or royal officials. It could store supplies. It could hold prisoners. It could house records, valuables, and weapons. It could become a last refuge if the outer defenses fell. But it also had a ceremonial role. The hall inside a keep was a room where disputes might be heard, orders given, hospitality displayed, and rank made visible. A castle was never only about resisting the enemy outside. It was also about arranging people inside. Who stood near the lord? Who waited below? Who entered the hall? Who remained at the gate? Who slept in comfort? And who slept near the horses? Medieval architecture did not simply protect hierarchy, it organized it. For ordinary people nearby, the shift from timber to stone could feel like the closing of a door. Imagine a mason at work near Rochester, or at another royal castle in the same expanding world of stone. The work is slow compared with timber. Blocks must be quarried, hauled, shaped, lifted. Lime mortar has to be prepared. Scaffolding creaks in the wind. Hands crack in cold weather. Dust clings to sweat and wool. The tower rises not in a burst of conquest, but day after day, season after season, until the skyline has been permanently changed. A villager or merchant passing beneath it would not need a lecture on feudal authority. The lesson was there in the height of the wall. Stone altered memory. A wooden palisade might be remembered as an imposition. A stone keep made imposition inheritable. Children could grow up under a tower their parents had watched being built. A market could adjust its habits around the shadow of a wall. A road could become inseparable from the fortress that watched it. This is why stone keeps were so useful to kings and lords. They stabilized conquest. They made administration safer. They gave officials places to collect, store, judge, and punish. They created strongpoints that could outlast a ruler's absence. A king did not have to be physically present in Rochester for royal power to be felt there. The castle made absence less dangerous, but that same advantage carried the old problem forward in a stronger form. A stone keep was harder to burn than timber. It was also harder to ignore if it fell into the wrong hands. Once a powerful castle existed, it became a prize. A rebel lord did not have to invent authority from nothing. If he could seize or hold a fortress, he inherited walls, storage, visibility, and bargaining power. This made castles politically unstable objects. From the royal point of view, building in stone was rational. It protected investment. It secured important sites. It projected confidence. But every permanent fortress also created a permanent question. Who would control it when loyalty became uncertain? The king could claim the castle as his. A bishop might administer it, a sheriff might supply it, a castellan might command it, a garrison might defend it. And in a crisis, the difference between ownership and control could become fatal. That tension would repeat throughout medieval history. Royal castles were meant to strengthen central authority, yet central authority had to pass through local hands. Noble castles were meant to protect aristocratic land, yet they could become centers of rebellion. Ecclesiastical castles, held by bishops or archbishops, could blur the line between spiritual office and military power. The walls were solid, the loyalties around them were not. This is why the stone keep should not be romanticized as a simple improvement over wood. It solved one set of problems and intensified another. It made castles more durable, more intimidating, more useful as administrative centers, and more valuable as military refuges. But by becoming valuable, they became dangerous. A weak wooden tower could be abandoned. A major stone castle had to be accounted for, supplied, defended, negotiated over, inherited, besieged, confiscated, repaired, and feared. It entered the political bloodstream. It affected budgets, rebellions, hostage arrangements, royal itineraries, and war plans. Stone made the castle less temporary. It also made the consequences of control less temporary. For the people who lived around these towers, daily life adjusted to their presence. Markets might grow near them. Roads might be redirected toward them. Craftsmen might find work because of them. Prisoners might disappear inside them. Peasants might shelter near them in war, then resent the dues and labor demanded in peace. The castle could protect and exploit the same community. That contradiction gave medieval fortresses their strange social power. They were not simply hated and not simply trusted. A town might rely on a castle in times of danger while fearing the officials who operated it. A merchant might benefit from safer roads while paying tolls that helped fund the garrison. A village might hide behind walls during a raid, then return to fields taxed by the lord, whose soldiers occupied those walls. The castle gathered these contradictions into stone. By the 12th century, the world of medieval power had become harder, taller, more expensive, and more permanent. What began after 1066 as fast occupation in wood and earth had entered a new phase. The castle was no longer just a response to immediate unrest. It was becoming part of how kingdoms imagined order itself. But stone did not remove violence from politics. It changed the form violence took. Instead of every conflict becoming a battle in the open, more conflicts turned into sieges, negotiations, blockades, mining operations, and tests of endurance. A stone keep could delay an enemy long enough to change a campaign. It could also trap people inside a slow disaster if help never came. The medieval battlefield was not disappearing. It was being joined by another kind of battlefield. The gatehouse, the cellar, the stairwell, the wall walk, the chamber where supplies were counted, the tunnel where miners listened for enemies beneath the earth. Stone had given power a stronger body. Now war would have to learn how to break it. A castle did not need to be under attack to be at war with the world around it. Most people who lived near a medieval castle would never see a grand siege. They would not watch trebuchets rise in the mist every morning. They would not hear miners scratching beneath the walls. They would not stand at the edge of history while kings and princes decided the fate of kingdoms. For them, The castle was usually something quieter, more ordinary, and in many ways more powerful. It was where dues were demanded. It was where disputes were heard. It was where prisoners disappeared behind doors. It was where the local lord ate, judged, stored, threatened, celebrated, and reminded everyone that authority had a roof, a gate, and guards. This is the part of medieval castles that ruins can hide from us. Modern eyes often see towers first, walls, battlements, arrow slits, the shape of danger. But in daily life, a castle could function less like a battlefield and more like a hardened office. Its violence was not always dramatic. Sometimes it appeared as a record, a fine, a toll, a locked room, a summoned tenant, a market fee, a dispute settled in favor of the man whose hall stood above the town. The medieval castle was a building where military power and administration touched the same table. That table might sit in a hall lit by candles and smoke. Around it could gather a lord's officers, clerks, stewards, messengers, petitioners, minor knights, servants, and men waiting for judgment. A local disagreement over land, debt, inheritance, or unpaid obligation could be pulled into the castle's orbit. The stone walls did not argue the case. They did something more subtle. They made the setting unequal before anyone spoke. A villager entering a castle court did not enter neutral ground. He passed under a gate. He crossed a yard watched by armed men. He heard horses shifting in the stables, boots on wooden stairs, voices from chambers above, perhaps the clink of metal from somewhere he could not see. By the time he reached the hall, the architecture had already explained its position. This was power as environment. No battlefield was required. In royal castles, the administrative role could be even more pronounced. A king could not sit personally in every shire or town. He relied on officers, sheriffs, constables, castellans, clerks, justices, stewards, to make authority travel. A castle helped them do that. It provided storage, security, symbolic weight, and a defensible base from which orders could be issued and enforced. The same place that held weapons could hold records. The same gate that stopped enemies could control movement. The same tower that sheltered a lord could overlook the market where tolls were collected. A castle made command practical. This matters because medieval government was often physically fragile. Paper, parchment, seals, and oaths mattered, but they needed force behind them. A written demand for payment meant more when it came from an officer backed by a garrison. A court judgment carried more weight when the losing party knew that refusal could lead to confinement. A road toll was easier to collect when the road passed beneath a controlled height. That did not mean every castle functioned identically. Some were major royal centers. Some were frontier posts. Some were noble residences. Some were military strongpoints with limited administrative activity. Some changed function across time. A castle near a contested border did not have the same daily rhythm as one dominating a wealthy inland town. But the general pattern was clear. Fortification gave local power a practical base. It also gave that power a stage. The hall of a castle mattered because medieval rule depended on visibility and rank. Who sat higher? Who entered first? Who waited outside? Who received hospitality? Who was made to stand? Who was allowed into private chambers? These were not decorative details. They were part of how hierarchy reproduced itself. Authority needed performance. A lord who feasted in a timber hut might still command men, but a lord who received guests inside a stone complex carried a different kind of weight. The walls participated in the ceremony. The approach, the gate, the hall, the chamber, the servants, the weapons, the banners, all of it created the impression that the social order was not simply enforced, but natural. And that impression could matter as much as the sword. A castle could make inequality feel built into the landscape. For a merchant, the castle might mean safer roads and more predictable markets. It might also mean tolls, inspections, obligations, and the knowledge that disputes with the Lord's men would not be judged in a place free from the Lord's presence. For a peasant, the castle might offer refuge during a raid. It might also demand labor, payments, cart service, supplies, or submission to a court whose rules were not designed for his comfort. For a prisoner, the castle became something else entirely. Medieval castles were not modern prisons in the institutional sense, but they could and did hold captives. Political hostages, debtors, rebels, local offenders, valuable prisoners taken in war, or people awaiting judgment. A locked chamber inside a fortified complex had a meaning no ordinary house could match. Escape was difficult, rescue was harder. The architecture itself became part of the punishment. Imagine a clerk in a castle chamber late in the day. The candles have burned low. The air smells of wax, damp wool, and old smoke. On the table are scraps of parchment, a knife for sharpening quills, a small pot of ink, and a list of names connected to fines, rents, supplies, or obligations. Outside, someone crosses the yard with a lantern. A horse stamps in the dark. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door closes with the dull sound of iron and wood meeting stone. The clerk is not a warrior, but his work helps the castle rule. He turns local life into records. He writes what is owed, who failed to appear, who paid, who resisted, who must be summoned again. His handwriting is not spectacular, but it extends the reach of the Lord as surely as a guard on the wall. Without such work, a castle would still be strong. It would not be as useful. This is where the medieval fortress becomes a system. Its strength did not come only from the thickness of walls. It came from the relationship between stone and paperwork, fear and routine, armed men and administrative memory. The castle made power durable because it gave command a place to gather information, store resources, and act upon both. That is why castles could make kingdoms stronger. A ruler with castles could impose order across distance. He could secure ports, bridges, roads, towns, and frontier zones. He could keep prisoners safely. He could store grain and weapons. He could lodge officials. He could make local communities negotiate with a visible center of authority rather than an absent idea of kingship. But every function added a new dependency. If the castle collected dues, someone had to record them. If it held prisoners, someone had to guard them. If it stored supplies, someone had to maintain them. If it commanded a road, someone had to patrol it. If it represented the king, someone had to make daily decisions in the king's name. The king's strength grew through delegation. So did his vulnerability, because the more a castle did, the more dangerous it became when its loyalty shifted. A fortress that was only a refuge could protect rebels. But a fortress that also held records, supplies, prisoners, officers, and local authority could do something more serious. It could preserve an alternate center of rule. A rebellious lord behind walls was not just a man hiding from royal anger. He might control storehouses, roads, tenants, tolls, local courts, and armed retainers. He could delay punishment. He could negotiate from safety. He could make the king spend money and time merely to restore what was supposed to be obedience. That is the hidden political problem inside the castle's daily usefulness. The same building that helped government function could become a government in miniature. For ordinary people, this meant power often arrived not as ideology, but as procedure. A summons, a toll, a fine, a locked gate, a demand for labor, a lord's officer asking why a payment had not been made, a guard deciding whether a cart could pass, a prisoner's family waiting outside walls with no clear answer. Medieval authority was not always spectacular. It could be patient, repetitive, and local. The castle made that patience possible. It allowed command to sit in one place long enough to become habit. It made people adjust their routes, expectations, disputes, and fears around a fortified center. It turned geography into administration. It turned administration into pressure. This is why castles spread so effectively across medieval Europe. They offered rulers and nobles a rare combination: shelter, intimidation, residence, storage, jurisdiction, and display. Few buildings could do so many political jobs at once, but that versatility came at a cost. Every new function tied more local life to the fortress. Every toll collected near its walls, every judgment pronounced in its hall, every prisoner kept in its chambers, every record stored under its roof made the castle more than a military structure. It became part of the social order itself. And once something becomes part of the social order, attacking it is no longer only a military act. It becomes a political crisis. That is why when castles were besieged, the stakes were rarely limited to stone and soldiers. A siege could threaten local administration, noble prestige, tax collection, prisoner custody, road control, and the credibility of whoever claimed authority over the region. To take a castle was to seize a working node of power. To lose one was to watch command become uncertain. By the time the great stone castles of medieval Europe had matured, they had already transformed war before a single siege engine rolled into place. They had changed what it meant to govern. They had changed how rulers appeared to their subjects. They had changed how local elites negotiated with the crown. They had made violence slower, but authority more constant. And because they were so useful in peace, they became devastating in war. The next chapter begins where the quiet machinery of rule breaks down. When the gates close, the stores are counted, the enemy camps outside, and the castle's many peaceful functions are reduced to one brutal question: how long can the people inside endure? A siege was not a battle against walls. It was a battle against time. When the gates closed, the castle changed character. The same courtyard that had held horses, clerks, servants, carts, prisoners, and market goods became a compressed world of fear and calculation. The hall that once displayed rank became a room where commanders discussed supplies. The stores beneath chambers mattered as much as the battlements above them. Every sack of grain, every barrel of ale, every salted side of meat, every working well, every usable arrow, every healthy horse became part of the fortress's remaining life. Outside, the attacker had his own problems. Taking a castle was rarely as simple as reaching the walls and being brave. Medieval fortifications were designed to punish impatience. Ditches slowed movement. Gatehouses concentrated danger. High walls made ladders uncertain. Narrow entrances exposed men to missiles from above. A direct assault could succeed, but it could also waste trained soldiers for little gain. So, armies often settled into the slower work of siege. They surrounded, they watched, they cut roads, They blocked supplies. They built camps and siege lines. They brought engineers, carpenters, miners, smiths, carts, animals, ropes, timber, stone, and food for their own men. They tried to turn the castle from a shield into a container, a place where hunger, fear, and disease could do what swords could not. This was war as endurance. A commander outside the walls had to ask practical questions before heroic ones. How long could his army remain in the field? Was there enough food for the besiegers? Would the weather break roads into mud? Could a relief force arrive? Would disease spread through the camp? Could miners reach the foundations? Could a gate be burned? Could someone inside be persuaded to surrender? A commander inside the castle had to ask the same kind of questions from the opposite side. How long would the stores last? Was the well secure? Were the walls damaged? Were the men paid? Were civilians consuming food needed by soldiers? Would loyalty hold if the siege dragged from days into weeks and weeks into months? The romantic image of the castle makes the defenders seem safe. The reality was more complicated. A castle protected bodies from immediate attack, but it also trapped those bodies inside a limited economy. Everything needed to be counted. The garrison could not eat the walls. The lord could not feed men with titles. A strong gate did not refill the granary. In many sieges, the first days might still carry discipline. Orders were clear. Watches were set. Arrows were stocked. Men repaired damaged sections of wall. Servants moved water and food. Priests prayed. Commanders measured the enemy's camp and waited for weakness. Then routine began to work on everyone. Inside the castle, a cook might stand over a pot that had been full a week earlier. At first, the portions are reduced quietly. Then the stew becomes thinner. Grain is stretched. Salt meat is cut smaller. Ale is guarded more carefully. The smell of smoke and boiled scraps lingers in the kitchen, while outside the room men pretend not to notice that hunger has become part of the daily order. No chronicler needed to invent this pressure. Sieges created it naturally. A defender could be brave in a single assault. It was harder to remain brave when the body weakened slowly, and there was no clear day of decision. Hunger made men listen differently. Rumors spread faster in enclosed places. A shout from the enemy camp, a distant horn, the crack of a stone striking masonry, the report of miners under the foundations. Each sound could become larger than it was because there was nowhere else for fear to go. Outside the walls, the attackers also suffered. An army in camp was not a clean instrument. It needed food, discipline, sanitation, animals, guards, and steady command. If the siege lasted too long, the besiegers could become prisoners of their own operation. Mud damaged carts, horses sickened, men deserted. Local countryside was stripped for supplies, which created resentment and scarcity. A lord might begin a siege believing he was demonstrating strength, only to discover that every week in front of the walls made his own weakness more visible. This was why siege warfare often became negotiation by other means. The attacker did not always need to storm the walls if he could make the defenders calculate surrender. The defenders did not always need to defeat the attacker if they could hold long enough for politics to change elsewhere. A siege could be a contest between a fortress and an army, but it was also a contest between budgets, reputations, supply networks, weather, disease, and patience. The weapons reflected that logic. Trebuchets and other engines could batter walls, throw stones, damage towers, and terrify the people inside. They were expensive and slow to build or transport, but they allowed an attacker to place constant pressure on a fortress without immediate assault. Mining offered another route. Men dug toward walls or towers, trying to weaken foundations, sometimes setting fires beneath timber supports to collapse sections of masonry. Defenders responded with countermines, listening through earth and stone for the dull sound of enemy work below. This gave siege warfare an unsettling intimacy. Enemies who might never meet in open battle could hear one another underground. Defenders placed bowls of water or other listening devices to detect vibration. Miners worked in cramped darkness, breathing dust, sweat, lamp smoke, and fear. Above them, commanders waited for signs that a section of wall had become vulnerable. A castle wall looked solid from a distance. Up close, it was a problem to be studied. The attacker asked where the masonry was weakest. Where did the ditch give cover? Where was the ground suitable for mining? Could the gatehouse be burned? Could a tower be isolated? Could a captured outer work give access to an inner ward? Siege warfare rewarded patience, technical knowledge, and the ability to keep men working under danger. This is why castles changed the rhythm of medieval campaigns. A field battle could be decisive in a day, though not always. A siege could consume a season. It could delay invasion, drain money, force nobles to remain in service longer than they wanted, and give distant rulers time to negotiate. A castle did not have to be invincible to matter. It only had to be difficult enough that taking it altered the campaign around it. Kenilworth Castle in 1266 shows the logic at its extreme. After the baronial conflicts of Henry III's reign, rebels held Kenilworth against royal forces. The siege became one of the longest in English medieval history, lasting 172 days. The castle's strength did not produce a glorious battlefield victory. It produced duration. The defenders resisted until disease, exhaustion, and dwindling supplies made continued resistance impossible. When they surrendered, they reportedly had only days of food left. The important point is not simply that Kenilworth was strong. The important point is what strength meant in practice. It meant the crown had to invest time, men, equipment, attention, and political patience into one fortress. It meant that rebellion could survive behind walls long after it would have been crushed in the open. It meant that a castle could turn defeat into delay and delay into leverage. That was useful for kings when the castle was theirs. It was dangerous when it was not. Siege warfare also changed the lives of people who were not soldiers. Civilians could be trapped inside fortresses or pushed outside them depending on strategic need. Refugees might crowd into a castle at the first sign of violence, bringing fear, animals, goods, children, and extra mouths. In some sieges, non-combatants became a burden to defenders because they consumed supplies. In others, they suffered outside the walls because the fortress could not or would not shelter everyone. The moral language of chivalry rarely captured this clearly. Siege was practical before it was noble. It measured human bodies against storage capacity. It turned villages into supply zones and civilians into problems of food, loyalty, movement, and disease. The lord's quarrel became the peasant's hunger. The king's campaign became the merchant's lost road. The rebel's defiance became the servant's thin meal. This is where castles made war colder. Not necessarily less violent, but more managerial. Commanders had to count. They had to estimate. They had to calculate how long men could remain useful under stress. A siege demanded not only courage, but administration. The same administrative world the castle had already helped create in peacetime. The fortress under siege revealed everything the fortress had always been. A storehouse, a command post, a prison, a symbol, a refuge, a burden, a bargaining chip. A machine that worked only as long as the human and material systems inside it continued to function. For the attacker, the ideal outcome was not always a breach. A surrender could be cleaner. A negotiated exit could preserve the structure. A captured castle could be used again. Destroying walls might solve one problem and create another, because a ruler who wanted to control territory often needed the fortress intact after victory. For the defenders, the ideal outcome was not always victory in the heroic sense. Sometimes it was survival until relief arrived. Sometimes it was honorable terms. Sometimes it was buying enough time for a political settlement. Sometimes it was simply avoiding massacre, confiscation, or disgrace. This is why castles made war so difficult to finish. They multiplied the number of endings a conflict could have. A campaign might win the field, but fail at the walls. A ruler might take one fortress and still face 3 more. A rebellion might lose support in open country, but endure inside a stronghold. A siege might end in assault, starvation, disease, negotiation, betrayal, or exhaustion. And among all those endings, one was especially feared. Not the wall breaking, not the tower falling, not even the granary emptying. The most dangerous ending was the quiet one, when someone inside decided that the gate should open. Because a castle under siege did not only test stone, it tested loyalty under pressure. It asked whether the men inside trusted their commander, whether the commander trusted his lord, whether the lord trusted the king, and whether everyone trusted the future enough to keep suffering for it. That question leads directly into the darkest part of the castle system. The enemy outside could be seen from the wall. The enemy inside could carry the keys. In a castle, loyalty was not an idea. It was a lock. A medieval fortress could survive fire, hunger, stones, mining, and months of pressure, but it could still fall in one quiet moment if the wrong man decided to open the gate. That was the fear every ruler had to live with. From the outside, a castle looked like certainty. Its walls seemed to separate danger from safety. Its towers made command visible. Its gatehouse forced enemies into narrow approaches where defenders could punish them. But inside the system, certainty was harder to find. A castle depended on people. Commanders, guards, servants, cooks, clerks, masons, priests, hostages, messengers, and soldiers whose loyalty had to survive conditions that could make obedience feel irrational. The most important person in that chain was often the castellan. He might be a royal officer, a noble retainer, a trusted soldier, a local lord, or a man appointed because someone powerful believed he could be relied upon. His job was practical before it was glorious. He had to maintain the walls, manage the garrison, guard prisoners, oversee stores, receive orders, answer threats, and decide what to do when written commands arrived too late or no longer matched the situation at the gate. This made him useful. It also made him dangerous. A king could claim ownership of a castle, but ownership was not the same as control. Control lived in daily access. Who held the keys? Who paid the guards? Who knew the storage levels? Who commanded the watch? Who could admit a messenger after dark? Who could delay a royal order by saying the road was unsafe or the situation unclear? In a stable realm, these details remained invisible. The king commanded, the officer obeyed. The garrison stood watch, and the castle appeared to function as part of royal authority. Crisis made the arrangement visible. A disputed succession, a baronial rebellion, an invasion, an unpaid garrison, or a siege could force everyone inside the fortress to ask where their survival truly lay. A castellan under pressure did not live in the clean moral world that later stories often prefer. He might have sworn loyalty to a king, but his family might be in the region. His lands might be vulnerable. His soldiers might be hungry. His lord might be negotiating with the enemy. The king might be far away, weak, dead, captured, or unable to send help. A rival claimant might appear more likely to win. A besieging army might offer terms. A delay of 1 week might save lives. A refusal might bring destruction. This was the difficult political atmosphere inside many medieval strongholds. Betrayal was not always a theatrical act. Sometimes it looked like calculation under pressure. Sometimes it looked like surrender before starvation. Sometimes it looked like a commander deciding that continued resistance served no purpose except pride. Sometimes it was corruption, fear, family interest, or simple exhaustion. The moral label depended heavily on who wrote the chronicle afterward. For kings, the problem was structural. They needed castles because they could not be everywhere. But because they could not be everywhere, they had to place those castles in the hands of others. A fortress extended royal reach, yet the extension always passed through a human intermediary. That intermediary could become the weak point in the strongest wall. This is why castle custody was politically sensitive. Kings worried about who held major fortresses. Rebels fought to seize them. Nobles demanded them as marks of status and security. Royal governments sometimes moved quickly to take castles back into direct control after periods of disorder. The issue was not merely architectural. A castle was a military resource, an administrative base, a prison, a storehouse, and a symbol of legal possession. To hold one was to hold options. During civil conflicts, these options multiplied. A rebel in open country had to keep moving or risk destruction. A rebel in a strong castle could wait. He could negotiate. He could force the king to spend money, assemble men, and bring siege equipment. He could make time work differently. He could turn a political disagreement into a logistical problem. The crown might win eventually, but victory could become expensive. That cost mattered because medieval kingship was not powered by unlimited resources. Campaigns required revenue, obligations, supplies, transport, and cooperation from elites who might already be uncertain. A single fortress in rebel hands could delay royal action elsewhere. Several fortresses could make rebellion feel like an alternate map of the kingdom. Inside such a castle, ordinary people lived inside that political uncertainty. Picture a guard assigned to a side gate during a crisis. He knows the commander's orders, but he also hears rumors from servants and men returning from the outer works. He hears that a noble has changed sides. He hears that the king is dead or nearly dead, or marching, or not marching at all. The truth arrives slowly. The rumors arrive quickly. In the guardroom, the air smells of smoke, damp leather, and stale bread. Someone has placed the gate keys on a peg where everyone can see them, but only one man has the authority to use them. That small room contains more politics than the banners above it suggest. The guard does not decide the fate of the realm alone, but he belongs to the chain through which command must pass. He can obey quickly hesitate, warn a friend, look away, or carry a message. A castle under stress is full of such minor choices. Most leave no trace in the records. Some may have changed outcomes. This is the part of castle warfare that makes certainty difficult. Chroniclers often preferred clear categories: loyal men, traitors, brave defenders, cowardly surrender. Those categories are not useless, but they can hide the practical conditions that shaped decisions. Hunger could look like disloyalty. Prudence could look like cowardice. Survival could be remembered as treason if the defeated party later regained power. Kings understood this, even when they condemned it. That is why hostages, oaths, bonds, offices, marriage ties, and threats all mattered in the world of castles. A ruler did not simply appoint a commander and forget him. He had to bind the commander into a network of interest. Loyalty became more reliable when obedience protected a man's property, family, rank, and future. It became weaker when those things seemed safer under someone else. The castle made this logic concrete. A lord with a fortress did not merely possess a residence. He possessed bargaining power. If the king needed him, the castle made him harder to ignore. If the king feared him, the castle made him harder to punish. If war came, the fortress gave him time to see which side might win. This affected aristocratic politics across medieval Europe. Royal authority often tried to limit private fortification, control castle building, demand surrender of key strongholds, or install trusted officials in sensitive places. Nobles resisted because castles were not decorative privileges. They were insurance. They protected families, stored wealth, secured local dominance, and gave their owners leverage in negotiations with the crown. The result was a constant tension between central power and fortified lordship. A king who tolerated too many independent castles risked fragmentation. A king who tried to seize too many castles risked provoking the very rebellion he wanted to prevent. The balance shifted depending on wealth, military pressure, royal personality, legal tradition, and the strength of noble families. This is why the castle system could make kingdoms both more governable and more unstable. In peaceful times, a network of castles allowed a ruler to project authority across distance. During crisis, the same network could become a map of potential disobedience. Each fortress asked the same question in a different place. Who does this wall obey when power is contested? The answer was never automatic. Dover had held for the crown because Hubert de Burgh remained committed to resistance. Kenilworth had allowed rebels to delay royal victory because its defenders endured behind strong walls. Other castles in other conflicts changed hands through negotiation, assault, surrender, starvation, or calculation. The pattern mattered more than any single case. The medieval castle turned loyalty into a material problem. It was not enough for a ruler to be legitimate on parchment. He needed men at the gates to act as though that legitimacy still had consequences. He needed supply officers to keep sending food. He needed soldiers to keep watch. He needed local communities to keep fearing or trusting the institution behind the wall. When those human systems held, the castle seemed almost invincible. When they weakened, the wall became only one part of a failing arrangement. This does not make castles less impressive. It makes them more historically revealing. Their strength depended on engineering, but also on trust, money, food, and expectation. They were stone structures held together by social agreements that could crack long before the masonry did, and once a great castle fell, whether by assault, hunger, surrender, or betrayal, the result could reach far beyond its walls. A fortress might control a river valley, guard a road, secure a province, or protect a frontier. Losing it could expose towns, weaken morale, damage royal prestige, and invite further defection. In a war of castles, one surrender could make other commanders recalculate their own futures. That is why the fall of a fortress was rarely just local news. It could change the political weather. The next chapter follows one of the clearest examples. A castle built by Richard the Lionheart to defend Normandy, praised for its strength, positioned to block a French advance, and still unable to save the world it was designed to protect. Its name was Chateau Gaillard. Chateau Gaillard proved that a fortress can be brilliant and still arrive too late to save the kingdom behind it. Above a bend of the River Seine, on a limestone spur near Les Andelys, Richard the Lionheart built one of the most famous castles of the Middle Ages. It was not placed there by accident. The Seine was not only water, it was a route into Normandy, a line of movement between Paris, Rouen, and the contested world of the Anglo-French frontier. Whoever controlled the river corridor could influence the movement of armies, supplies, merchants, and political pressure. In the late 12th century, that mattered because Normandy was not merely a province. It was the heartland of the dynasty that had conquered England. Richard understood the danger. The King of France, Philip II Augustus, was not content to leave the Plantagenets in possession of a great cross-channel power. The English king held England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and other territories, in varying degrees of authority and tension. This was not a neat modern state. It was a web of lordships, obligations, inheritances, rival claims, local loyalties, and personal rule. The map looked impressive, but it depended on constant movement, money, military pressure, and a king capable of forcing the pieces to remain connected. Richard was such a king in some ways. He had military energy, reputation, and a gift for dramatic action. But his reign was also expensive, restless, and shaped by war. He spent relatively little time in England. He raised money aggressively. He fought to defend the continental inheritance that gave the Plantagenets their broader weight. In that struggle, Chateau Gaillard was not a vanity project. It was a strategic answer. Construction began in the 1190s after conflict with Philip II made the Seine frontier urgently important. The castle was built rapidly and at great cost. Its position was chosen to dominate the river approach and strengthen the defense of Rouen, the Norman capital. It formed part of a larger defensive system, including the town and surrounding works, designed to slow or block French advance. Even its name carried confidence. Chateau Gaillard, the saucy castle, the bold castle, the defiant castle. The phrase may carry the flavor of later retelling, but the political meaning fits the structure. It was meant to look aggressive. It was meant to tell Philip that the road into Normandy had acquired teeth. The castle's design reflected that purpose. It used the cliff, the river, multiple lines of defense, towers, walls, and carefully arranged approaches to make attack difficult. It was not simply a tower waiting to be surrounded. It was a system of obstacles. An enemy would have to deal with the outer defenses, the terrain, the approaches, and the problem of sustaining a siege in hostile conditions. From a distance, it must have seemed deeply reassuring to the men who trusted it. stone on height, walls watching the river, a royal statement fixed into the landscape, a fortress built by a king whose reputation had been forged in crusade and war. If any castle could make Normandy feel secure, this was the one. But architecture cannot replace political coherence. When Richard died in 1199, the castle remained. The strategic problem remained too. What changed? Was the ruler responsible for holding the system together? John inherited a difficult world. He did not inherit Richard's military reputation. He did not inspire the same confidence among nobles. His continental position was fragile, and Philip II understood the opportunity. The French king did not need to destroy the entire Plantagenet world in one stroke. He could pressure it in pieces. He could isolate, negotiate, attack, wait, and exploit John's failures. Chateau Gaillard became central because it guarded the route toward Rouen. If it held, French progress could be slowed. If it fell, Normandy would become far harder for John to defend. But the castle's strength created a dangerous illusion. It could delay Philip. It could complicate his campaign. It could force him to invest time and men. What it could not do was solve John's broader problems of legitimacy, leadership, finance, noble loyalty, and strategic response. A fortress needs a world around it to remain functional. It needs roads that can be held, stores that can be supplied, commanders who can coordinate, allies who remain committed, and a ruler who can relieve pressure before delay becomes isolation. Without that wider system, even a stronghold becomes a place where defenders wait for decisions made elsewhere. Philip began the siege in 1203. The operation was not a simple attack on a wall. It involved isolating the fortress, taking or neutralizing surrounding positions, controlling movement, and reducing the defensive system piece by piece. This was siege warfare at the level of strategy. Philip did not have to admire the castle. He had to make it lonely. Inside and around Chateau Gaillard, the human cost grew. Local people were caught between armies and walls. In times of war, civilians often fled toward fortified places because the castle seemed safer than open country. But safety inside a siege was conditional. Extra mouths consumed food. Commanders had to think in numbers, not comfort. Shelter could become pressure if stores ran low. Imagine refugees near the fortress as the siege tightened. A family might arrive with what could be carried: a bundle of cloth, a small knife, perhaps a little bread. A child wrapped against the cold, an animal too valuable to leave behind. The air near the castle would carry smoke from fires, damp from the river, and the noise of men preparing works they did not explain to civilians. Everyone could see the walls. Not everyone could be protected by them indefinitely. This is where the castle's promise became complicated. To those outside, it looked like security. To those responsible for defending it, every additional person became part of the arithmetic of endurance. Food, space, disease, discipline, and morale were not abstractions. They were daily limits. The siege exposed another truth about great fortresses. They could concentrate hope so strongly that their fall became psychologically larger than their stones. When people trusted a castle to hold a frontier, losing it did not merely open a road. It damaged the belief that the frontier was still defensible. The stronger the castle's reputation, the more meaningful its collapse became. Philip's forces gradually overcame the defenses. The details of medieval siege narratives can be difficult, and later accounts often sharpen episodes for drama. But the broad result is clear. The French isolated the castle, pressed the surrounding works, exploited weaknesses, and eventually took Chateau Gaillard in 1204 after a prolonged siege. Once it fell, the defense of Normandy deteriorated quickly. Rouen surrendered later that year, and the duchy passed into Capetian hands. For John, the loss was devastating. Normandy was not just territory on a map. It was the ancestral base of the kings who had taken England. Losing it changed the balance of power between the Capetian monarchy and the Plantagenets. It damaged John's prestige among his nobles. It reduced his continental position. It forced England into a different relationship with the politics of France. A castle had fallen, but the consequences reached far beyond Les Andelys. This is the reason Chateau Gaillard matters so much to the larger story of medieval castles. It was not a weak fortress. It was not a foolish design. It was not placed in an irrelevant location. Its failure does not prove that castles were useless. In fact, the opposite is closer to the truth. It mattered because castles were useful. Its fall mattered because everyone understood what it had been built to protect. The problem was that castles could only answer certain kinds of danger. They could resist assault. They could delay movement. They could shape campaigns. They could protect crossings and force enemies into siege. They could make war more expensive, but they could not compensate forever for poor leadership, damaged trust, strategic isolation, or the absence of a successful relief effort. John's failure in Normandy was not caused by one wall breaking. It came from a broader weakness in political command. Philip II applied pressure with patience. John failed to maintain the confidence and coordination necessary to defend the duchy. Chateau Gaillard became the visible point where a larger structure gave way. For the defenders, the end would have been more immediate than the grand political meaning. There would be orders, shouting, smoke, broken masonry, men retreating from one defensive position to another. The knowledge that an outer work lost today made the inner defenses more vulnerable tomorrow. In such moments, strategy collapses into movement. Where to stand, what to carry, who is wounded, which passage is still safe, whether the command still holds. A siege reduces political ambition to physical conditions. The royal claim to Normandy meant little to a soldier trying to hold a passage after days of exhaustion. Philip's long strategy meant little to a civilian waiting to see whether surrender would bring mercy, expulsion, or worse. The famous name of the castle meant little to a defender if no army arrived to relieve it. And yet those physical conditions changed politics. When Chateau Gaillard fell, it helped open the way for Philip to consolidate control over Normandy. The Capetian monarchy gained territory, resources, prestige, and momentum. The Plantagenet world lost one of its central continental anchors. John's reputation suffered further, feeding the tensions that would later explode in England during the baronial crisis. Here, the long chain of castle power becomes visible. Richard built the fortress to secure a frontier. The fortress depended on the political system behind it. John inherited both the castle and the strategic burden. Philip attacked not only the walls, but the connections around them. The castle's fall helped transform a regional military failure into a dynastic and political wound. Chateau Gaillard, therefore, reveals the limits of architectural confidence. Medieval rulers loved strongholds because strongholds made power appear solid. But no wall exists outside politics. Every fortress belongs to a network of money, command, morale, roads, neighbors, rival claims, and human decisions. Cut enough of those connections, and even a masterpiece becomes exposed. This is not an argument against castles. It is an argument against misunderstanding them. A castle was never a magic object. It was a concentration of resources. It could multiply strength, but it could not create strength from nothing. It could preserve authority, but only if authority still had substance behind the gate. It could make a ruler look untouchable, but if the territory behind it was politically unstable, the fortress might become the last confident object in a failing system. That is the tragedy of Chateau Gaillard. It did much of what it was supposed to do. It slowed the enemy. It demanded effort. It became a major obstacle. It forced Philip II into the work of siege rather than the speed of easy advance. But delay is not salvation unless someone uses the time. John did not. After 1204, the loss of Normandy reshaped English and French politics. The Plantagenets did not disappear, but their continental power was changed. The English crown would spend generations living with the consequences of lands lost across the Channel. The rivalry between English kings and French kings did not end. It deepened, hardened, and changed form. The castle remained as stone. The world it was built to defend did not remain with it. This is why the next stage of the story must move from a single fortress to an entire strategy of domination. If one castle could not save Normandy, what if a king built many castles together? Not merely to defend a frontier, but to lock down a conquered people. That was the experiment Edward I would attempt in Wales. Edward I did not merely conquer Wales. He made occupation architectural. By the late 13th century, the English crown had learned something essential from generations of castle warfare. A single stronghold could dominate a road, a river, a town, or a valley. A great fortress could delay an enemy, anchor a frontier, or preserve authority during a crisis. But one castle, however impressive, remained vulnerable to isolation if the wider political world around it failed. Edward I's answer in Wales was not one castle. It was a system. The conflict between the English crown and the Welsh princes had deep roots. Wales was not an empty frontier waiting to be organized from outside. It had its own dynastic rivalries, laws, lordships, landscapes of loyalty, and memories of resistance. Mountain passes, river valleys, coastal routes, and local strongholds shaped the possibilities of war. English kings had tried to impose authority there before. Some had succeeded temporarily. None had fully solved the problem. Edward approached it with a colder kind of ambition. He was not simply trying to win a campaign. He wanted to make future resistance harder to organize. After the War of 1277 and the more decisive campaigns of 1282 and 1283, the death of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd and the defeat of Welsh princely power opened the way for a new settlement. Edward did not treat victory as enough. He followed victory with law, administration, settlement, and stone. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 formalized English authority over much of the conquered territory. But documents alone could not command mountains. Laws written under royal authority needed places from which they could be enforced. The English crown needed roads, ports, officials, garrisons, storage, courts, and towns loyal to the new order. This is where the castles came in. Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, Beaumaris, and others did not appear as isolated monuments of military vanity. They belonged to a broader strategy that tied fortification to administration and settlement. These castles were often placed near water, linked to supply by sea, and integrated with walled towns where English settlers, merchants, officers, and soldiers could live under protection. The result was not simply a line of defences. It was an imported political geography. The Welsh landscape was being rewritten. At Conwy, the castle and town walls rose beside the estuary, creating a fortified English borough in a place tied to Welsh princely power. At Caernarfon, the massive walls and polygonal towers were designed to impress as well as defend, projecting royal authority in a region where symbolism mattered. Harlech stood high above the coast, supplied by access to the sea, a reminder that a castle could remain connected even when the land around it became hostile. Beaumaris, begun later on Anglesey, represented one of the most sophisticated forms of concentric castle design, though it was never fully completed as originally intended. These were not accidents of architecture. They show how deeply Edward understood the link between military control and logistics. A castle in hostile territory could become a trap if supplied only by land. A coastal fortress, connected to royal shipping, could outlast local resistance more effectively. Sea's access allowed food, men, weapons, and messages to move even when roads were uncertain. In Wales, where terrain favoured resistance and local knowledge mattered, the coast became part of the occupation system. The cost was enormous. Stone had to be quarried or transported. Timber had to be cut. Lime had to be burned. Ironwork, tools, ropes, scaffolding, carts, animals, masons, diggers, carpenters, smiths, clerks, guards, and labourers all had to be organised. Men like Master James of St. George became important because Edward's project required technical skill at scale. Castle building was not merely a royal wish. It was a logistical campaign that continued after the fighting slowed. For the English crown, the expense made sense because these fortresses were intended to do several jobs at once. They protected garrisons, they guarded ports, they housed officials, they anchored new towns, they watched roads and river mouths, they displayed royal authority, they provided places from which English law could operate. They also gave settlers confidence that the conquest would be defended. A wall around a town was not only a military feature. It was an invitation to inhabit someone else's conquered landscape with less fear. For the Welsh population, the meaning was very different. Imagine a family near one of these building sites in the 1280s. The war has ended in the official sense, but the presence of soldiers, labor demands, carts, tools, and foreign-speaking workers shows that peace has not restored the old world. The air smells of whetstone, wood smoke, lime, and animal sweat. New walls rise where old patterns of authority once operated. The castle is not attacking anyone that morning. Still, its construction changes what can be expected from the future. A child growing up near Conwy or Caernarfon would see something his grandparents had not seen in the same way. A fortified English town designed to stay. That was the psychological force of Edward's castles. They made conquest visible across generations. The first Norman, Mott and Bailey, had announced arrival in wood and earth. Edward's Welsh castles announced settlement, surveillance, and administrative permanence in stone. They did not need to win every day by violence. They could win by remaining. But the system was not only psychological, it was practical. The castles helped Edward avoid one of the great problems of conquest: distance from the centre. A king could not ride constantly through Wales to enforce obedience. The castles made local enforcement possible. They gave royal agents secure bases and allowed military response to begin from within the conquered zone rather than from England alone. This turned the landscape into a network of pressure points. A rebellion might flare in one district, but nearby castles and walled towns could resist, communicate, and shelter loyal forces. A coastal route could supply garrisons even if inland roads became unsafe. English settlers could cluster under protection, changing the social and economic life around the fortress. Courts and officials could operate from fortified spaces where resistance was harder to apply directly. Edward's strategy, therefore, shows the castle at its most mature as an instrument of state power. It was no longer just a refuge for a lord or a tower above a market. It became part of a territorial program. Military architecture, law, colonization, trade, and administration worked together. The castle was a node in a larger structure of rule, yet this success created its own strain. The Welsh castles were expensive to build and maintain. They required garrisons, repairs, supplies, and administrative attention. Their very scale reveals both the confidence and the anxiety of the conquest. A ruler does not build such a system because he feels no fear. He builds it because he understands that victory alone has not made obedience secure. The walls were evidence of domination. They were also evidence that domination needed constant support. Edward could defeat Welsh princely resistance, but he could not make the conquered landscape forget what had been taken from it. Stone could control roads and ports. It could protect settlers and officials. It could make rebellion harder, slower, and more expensive. But it could not erase grief, resentment, language, law, kinship, or memory. This distinction matters. A castle can change behavior without changing belief. People may obey because the cost of refusing has become too high. They may pay because soldiers are nearby. They may enter a new town because trade demands it. They may appear in a court because the alternative is punishment. None of that necessarily means they accept the moral right of the new order. In Wales, the castles worked because they made English authority difficult to dislodge. They did not work by making it loved. That is why Edward's Ring of Stone should be seen as both a triumph of medieval statecraft and a sign of the limits of conquest. It shows how far royal power could go when it combined military victory with engineering, finance, law, and logistics. It also shows that such power remained dependent on constant maintenance. The castle system had to be fed, repaired, manned, and believed in by the people who operated it. For the garrison inside a Welsh castle, the daily reality might be less grand than the royal plan. A soldier on the wall at Harlech might look toward the sea because that was where supplies and reassurance could come from. Inland, the country beyond the walls was not simply scenery. It was the reason the walls had been built. The soldier's routine: watch, meal, repair, patrol, sleep, alarm, belonged to a larger strategy he may not have understood fully, but his body helped maintain it. For the mason, the castle was labor and precision. For the clerk, it was accounts and orders. For the merchant, it was risk and opportunity. For the Welsh villager, it could be a warning that the conquest was not leaving. These different meanings coexisted inside the same stone. That is why Edward's Welsh castles remain so visually powerful. They are beautiful now because time has stripped away much of their immediate violence. Tourists see walls, towers, sea light, mountain air, and the drama of medieval design. But in their own time, these structures were not neutral monuments. They were tools of rule imposed after defeat. Their beauty should not soften their purpose. Conwy's walls did not rise only to decorate an estuary. Caernarfon's towers did not speak only to architectural ambition. Harlech's position was not chosen only for scenery. Beaumaris was not conceived merely as a masterpiece of design. Each belonged to a program that joined stone to sovereignty. Edward's castles show the medieval fortress at the height of its confidence, but they also prepare the next part of the story. Because once castles became part of large territorial systems, their cost and complexity increased. To build them was expensive. To maintain them was relentless. To garrison them required money. To supply them required roads, ports, ships, animals, and administrative discipline. To rely on them meant accepting permanent obligations. The king who built a ring of stone also built a ring of expenses. And that expense leads into the next problem. A castle could make a ruler look untouchable, but the more walls he built, the more his authority depended on the taxes, labor, records, payments, and supply routes needed to keep those walls alive. Every wall that made a king safer also sent a bill somewhere else. By the time Edward I's castles rose across Wales, medieval rulers had learned how powerful fortified stone could be. A castle could command a road, defend a port, intimidate a town, protect a garrison, and make conquest feel permanent. A network of castles could do something even larger. It could turn victory into administration. But administration had a price. The visible cost was stone. The less visible cost was everything required to keep stone meaningful after the masons left. A castle was not finished when the last block was set into place. It needed guards, constables, carpenters, blacksmiths, food, weapons, wages, repairs, animals, fuel, water systems, doors, hinges, roofing, records, and supply routes that did not fail in winter. A ruined castle looks silent now. In its own time, it was a continuing expense. The money had to come from somewhere. Royal revenue, local dues, feudal obligations, market tolls, fines, customs, borrowed funds, extraordinary taxation, confiscated lands, and forced labor could all become part of the financial background behind walls. The castle stood in one place, but its cost traveled outward through the countryside. For kings, this was acceptable only if the castle performed enough work in return. A fortress guarding a vital port could protect trade and invasion routes. A castle near a rebellious frontier could reduce the risk of renewed war. A stronghold above a road could secure communication between regions. A royal castle in a key town could strengthen administration. But each practical benefit had to be measured against the resources required to sustain it. This was the hidden arithmetic of medieval security. The builder paid first, the ruler paid again. The local population often paid continuously. In Wales, Edward's great building program demanded extraordinary organization. Master masons and skilled craftsmen had to be recruited. Laborers had to move materials. Timber, lime, iron, lead, and stone had to reach sites that were not always convenient. Coastal access helped, but sea supply also required ships, sailors, harbors, weather, and coordination. A fortress like Harlech was powerful, partly because it could be supplied from the sea. But that advantage still depended on functioning logistics. The same was true elsewhere. A castle that appeared invulnerable from outside could become weak if its support system thinned. A broken roof let weather damage rooms. Unpaid soldiers became unreliable. Rotting timber weakened gates and hoardings. Empty stores made siege resistance impossible. Missing records made local obligations harder to enforce. A fortress was strong only if its maintenance remained stronger than neglect. This made castles unusually demanding objects of power. A king could not simply own them in theory. He had to keep them operational. The wall had to be repaired before the next crisis. The garrison had to remain disciplined before the next rebellion. The constable had to be loyal before the next claimant appeared. The granary had to be stocked before the next siege began. Castles made rulers think ahead. They also forced rulers to extract. Imagine a tax collector riding into a village after another round of royal building or repair demands. He does not arrive with the drama of a siege engine. He arrives with names, obligations, and a schedule. The road is wet. The horse is tired. In the village, people already know why he has come before he speaks. Grain has been counted once for household survival, again for rent, again for dues, and now the distant wall requires its own share. The castle may be miles away. Its appetite is present. This is how large systems reach ordinary lives, not always through battle. Sometimes through a man with a register, a cart requisition, a demand for labor, or an instruction that timber must be cut and moved. The peasant does not need to see the king to feel royal policy. He feels it when his time, animals, grain, or coins are redirected toward maintaining a structure built in the name of security. That security could be real. It would be too simple to say castles only oppressed. In violent landscapes, fortified places could protect communities, shelter goods, secure markets, and make roads safer. A merchant might prefer tolls and guards to open insecurity. A village might resent the castle in peace, but run toward it during war. A town might grow under the protection of walls and garrisons. The problem was not that castles were useless. The problem was that usefulness gave rulers reasons to keep spending. A fortress that controlled a strategic point could rarely be abandoned casually. Once built, it created expectations. Local officials depended on it. Soldiers were stationed there. Prisoners might be held there. Roads and markets might be organized around it. Royal prestige might be attached to it. Letting it decay could signal weakness. Losing it could invite rebellion. Repairing it could anger taxpayers. The choice was rarely clean. This is why castles could become financial traps. A ruler built them to reduce danger, but the act of reducing danger created permanent obligations. The stronger the network, the more complicated the maintenance. A single castle might be affordable. Dozens could become an administrative landscape of wages, repairs, inspections, supplies, and appointments. For a wealthy and disciplined monarchy, that burden could be managed. For a weaker ruler, it could become dangerous. Unpaid garrisons might become resentful. Neglected castles might become vulnerable. Local officers might use their positions for private profit. Nobles might demand custody of castles as reward or leverage. A fortress could shift from asset to liability without changing its outward shape. The walls might still stand. The system behind them might be thinning. Medieval documents often reveal this quieter world of castle maintenance. Orders for repairs, accounts for building materials, wages for workers, inventories of weapons, lists of provisions, and appointments of constables show a reality less romantic than the silhouette of a tower. Someone had to count arrows. Someone had to inspect roofing. Someone had to pay men to guard a gate at night when nothing seemed to be happening. That nothing was part of the cost. A castle was valuable because it was ready before danger arrived. But readiness is expensive precisely because most days are not dramatic. A garrison consumes food whether an enemy appears or not. A gate needs maintenance before the assault comes. A well must remain usable before the siege begins. Preparedness drains resources quietly. Kings needed this preparedness because medieval politics was uncertain. A loyal noble today could be a rebel tomorrow. A frontier that seemed calm in spring could become unstable by autumn. A treaty might fail. A disputed inheritance could trigger armed conflict. A foreign ruler might exploit domestic weakness. Castles offered insurance against these dangers, but insurance required payment whether or not disaster came. The burden often fell unevenly. Great lords could shift obligations downward. Royal officials could demand supplies from districts far removed from court life. Laborers could be compelled to help with work whose political purpose did not benefit them directly. Towns might gain protection, but also heavier oversight. Frontier communities might live with the constant presence of soldiers whose protection and pressure were difficult to separate. This is where the castle system touched the social order. It did not merely defend hierarchy. It required hierarchy to finance itself. Those with command could decide where fortifications mattered. Those beneath command often paid in labor, dues, movement restrictions, or exposure to military activity. The castle made power visible in stone, but its foundation extended into fields, workshops, roads, and ledgers. For the king, this created a delicate problem. He needed castles to look strong, yet demanding too much to support them could make him politically weaker. Heavy taxation and forced service could alienate nobles, towns, clergy, and rural communities. Asking elites for military or financial support could expose how much the crown depended on their cooperation. A king who built too aggressively might appear powerful in the landscape, while provoking resentment in the political community that sustained him. Edward I's reign shows both sides of that equation. His Welsh castles remain among the most impressive monuments of medieval royal ambition. They demonstrate organization, technical skill, strategic clarity, and the ability to convert conquest into permanent infrastructure. But they also belong to a broader pattern of expensive warfare and governance. Campaigns in Wales, Scotland, and beyond required resources. Military greatness was inseparable from fiscal pressure. This pattern did not end with Edward. Across medieval Europe, rulers faced similar problems whenever fortification became central to control. Build too little, and territory remained vulnerable. Build too much, and revenue strained. Trust too many local commanders, and castles might become independent power bases. Keep too many fortresses under direct royal management, and administration became heavier. The castle solved one problem by creating others. This was not failure in the simple sense. It was the normal cost of making power material. A law could be written quickly compared with a war. A royal command could be issued faster than a garrison could be paid for a year. A claim to land could be sealed on parchment, but holding that land required bodies, food, roads, discipline, and buildings that survived weather. The medieval castle forced rulers to confront the material side of authority. Power needed roofs. It needed locks. It needed bread. It needed men willing to stand watch through rain and boredom. And all of that had to be funded. The people paying did not always interpret these expenses as noble security. Sometimes they saw only another demand from above, another cart taken, another animal requisitioned, another market fee, another repair order, another campaign whose purpose belonged to men far from the village. That resentment might remain quiet for years. Quiet did not mean absent. A kingdom covered in castles could appear orderly because resistance had become harder to organize. But beneath the surface, the costs of order accumulated. The crown needed more revenue to maintain control. Local communities carried more burdens. Nobles negotiated harder for privileges. Officers found opportunities for profit. The same system that made royal authority visible could expose how dependent that authority was on cooperation from below and loyalty from in between. This is the deeper meaning of the castle's price. It was not only financial, it was political. The king paid in money, but also in trust. He paid by delegating command. He paid by depending on officers. He paid by taxing people who might resent him. He paid by creating fortresses that enemies wanted and rebels could use. He paid by turning security into a permanent administrative obligation. A castle looked like a final answer from outside. From inside the government that maintained it, it was an ongoing question. Can the realm afford the walls it needs? Can the garrisons be trusted? Can the people be taxed without revolt? Can the nobles be controlled without alienating them? Can a ruler keep enough fortresses strong without making the entire structure too expensive to sustain? For centuries, medieval rulers answered those questions imperfectly. They repaired, taxed, delegated, confiscated, negotiated, built, abandoned, rebuilt, and adapted. Some castles flourished, some decayed, some became palaces, some became prisons, some became ruins, while newer forms of defense took shape around them. Then came a new pressure. At first, it did not make castles irrelevant. It did not sweep away stone overnight, but it changed the old confidence. The high wall, the proud tower, the gatehouse, designed to dominate men with ladders and rams. All of them would face an enemy that did not need to climb. Gunpowder would not simply attack castles. It would attack the assumptions behind them. Gunpowder did not destroy the castle overnight. It taught stone that distance was no longer safety. For centuries, medieval castles had been designed around a basic relationship between height and danger. A high wall gave defenders vision, advantage, and time. A tower forced attackers to climb, crowd, expose themselves, and suffer under missiles from above. A gatehouse concentrated movement into a place where the defenders controlled the terms of violence. Against ladders, rams, arrows, stones, fire, mining, and hunger, castle architecture had developed a long language of resistance. Then a new sound entered the siege. It was not elegant at first. Early gunpowder weapons were awkward, unreliable, smoky, dangerous to operate, and not always decisive. They did not instantly make every castle obsolete. Medieval war rarely changed with the neatness that later summaries prefer. Old methods remain: trebuchets, mining, blockade, negotiation, starvation, and betrayal continued to matter. For a long time, gunpowder artillery joined the siege rather than replacing every older weapon. But even before it became fully dominant, it changed the imagination of attack. A wall that once forced men to approach with ladders could now be struck repeatedly from a distance. A tower that once looked down on attackers could become a target. Height, which had always been part of the castle's authority, began to carry risk. The proud vertical face of masonry offered the gunner something to measure. At first, the change was uneven. Some castles adapted, some remained useful because of location, politics, or limited local artillery. Some were strengthened, lowered, thickened, or modified. Some continued as residences, prisons, administrative centers, or symbols even after their pure military value declined. The story is not that one invention ended 1,000 years of fortification in a single dramatic moment. The story is more gradual and more interesting. Gunpowder forced rulers, engineers, and commanders to reconsider what a wall was supposed to do. Older castles had often relied on height, layered access, and the difficulty of getting close. Artillery rewarded different qualities: thickness, low profiles, angled defenses, earthworks, platforms for guns, and the ability to absorb impact. The old castle had been designed to dominate men. The new artillery environment required fortifications to survive machines. This did not make stone useless. It made old confidence expensive. A ruler looking at a traditional castle in the 15th or 16th century had to ask questions that earlier builders had not asked in the same way. Could the walls resist cannon fire? Could guns be mounted effectively from the defenses? Were the towers too tall and vulnerable? Could the ditch protect against artillery positions? Was there room to create new earthworks? Would modification cost more than the site was worth? Again, the castle became a financial question. The same structure that once promised security now demanded adaptation. A wall built for one kind of war might survive into another kind, only if money, labor, and engineering followed. If they did not, the castle might remain impressive to the eye while becoming less convincing to a trained attacker. For the people inside, gunpowder changed the experience of siege. A trebuchet stone was terrifying, but artillery carried a different psychological force. The smoke, flash, recoil, noise, and repeated impact could turn distance into pressure. Defenders could no longer assume that a wall's height alone made the enemy's work slow and intimate. Damage could arrive with a sound that rolled across the field before dust broke from the masonry. Imagine a gun crew outside a castle at dawn. The ground is damp. Powder must be kept dry. Men move carefully because the weapon they serve is dangerous even before it harms the enemy. Someone checks the charge. Someone watches the angle. Someone swabs, loads, lifts, waits. The air smells of smoke, iron, sweat, and wet earth. When the gun fires, the violence is not personal, but the result is visible, a mark on stone that can be repeated. Inside the castle, the defenders count those marks. This was the new anxiety. A medieval wall could survive a single impact. The danger was repetition. Artillery turned damage into a process. A breach could be prepared. A section could be weakened over time. Commanders could choose targets, adjust range, and concentrate force. The wall was no longer only an obstacle. It became a problem of applied pressure. That did not remove older siege realities. Food still mattered. Water still mattered. Morale still mattered. Treachery still mattered. A cannon could damage a wall, but an army still needed to exploit the breach. Men still had to move under danger. A commander still had to hold the field, pay soldiers, protect supply lines, and decide whether the cost of assault was worth the result. But the balance was shifting. A castle that had once made war slow now faced a weapon designed to accelerate the moment of decision. Artillery did not always succeed quickly, yet it gave attackers a more direct way to challenge masonry. It reduced some of the old dependence on starvation and negotiation. It made the defenders' confidence less secure. Rulers noticed, in some places, castles were modernized, towers were cut down or reshaped, gun ports were added, earthworks were developed to absorb artillery fire better than bare vertical stone. Later fortification would move toward bastions, angled lines, and lower, thicker defenses. The medieval castle did not simply vanish. It evolved, was replaced, or was repurposed, depending on the political and economic context. This is important because ruins can mislead. When a castle stands roofless today, it is easy to imagine that gunpowder alone killed it. But many castles declined for mixed reasons. Changing warfare, changing residence patterns, political centralization, maintenance cost, shifts in noble life, civil wars, deliberate slighting, or simple neglect. Artillery was a major pressure, but it worked alongside other pressures that had already been building inside the castle system. The old problem remained beneath the new technology. Castles were expensive. They needed garrisons. They depended on loyal commanders. They required repair. They could become rebel strongholds. They helped rulers project power, but they also forced rulers into the long work of upkeep. Gunpowder did not create these tensions. It made some of them harder to ignore. A king now had to decide which castles deserved investment. Not every fortress could be saved. Not every wall could be thickened. Not every tower could be adapted. Strategic importance mattered more than romance. A castle guarding a major harbor or border might justify redesign. A minor inland stronghold might become less useful as military priorities changed. Some castles drifted toward domestic comfort or administrative function. Others remained militarized. Some decayed slowly into the landscapes they had once dominated. For the aristocracy, the change had social meaning too. The medieval castle had long been a sign of lordship. It advertised local command, lineage, security, and rank. But as artillery changed, military architecture and royal governments grew more capable of controlling violence, the private castle became less central as an independent military base in many regions. Noble power did not disappear. It changed its forms. Court access, offices, land ownership, marriage, finance, patronage, and political influence could matter more than holding a tower against the king. Stone prestige survived longer than stone military confidence. A lord might still want a great residence that looked ancient and commanding. A family might preserve towers as symbols of status. A ruler might use castles as prisons, arsenals, administrative sites, or ceremonial spaces. But the old image of the castle as the supreme answer to war had been damaged. Gunpowder did something psychologically important. It made the castle look historical while it was still standing. This did not happen everywhere at once. In some frontier zones and less artillery-intensive contexts, older fortifications remained meaningful for a long time. Terrain, wealth, local warfare, and political fragmentation affected the pace of change. A poorly supplied artillery force was not automatically superior to a well-positioned fortress. Technology mattered, but so did competence and circumstance. Still, the direction was clear. The high medieval castle had been built around the idea that attackers could be controlled as they approached. Gunpowder artillery allowed attackers to begin changing the wall before they reached it. That distinction slowly transformed military architecture. Fortification became less vertical, more geometric, more mathematical, and more integrated with artillery of its own. The castle's old body was no longer enough. In places where rulers had the money, engineers redesigned defense. In places where they did not, older castles remained as aging assets. Useful in some roles, vulnerable in others. Their future depended less on legend than on budgets, politics, and strategic geography. For ordinary people, the change might have been confusing. The castle still looked powerful. Its walls still rose over the town. Its gates still controlled entry. Its towers still held memory. But soldiers and engineers might speak differently now. They might discuss powder storage, gun platforms, thicker earthworks, or whether a tower was too exposed. A structure that had once seemed permanent began to sound like a problem requiring revision. A mason repairing old damage might not think he was witnessing the end of an age. He would simply know the work had changed. The stone had to be patched where impact struck. Openings might be altered. Timber platforms might be reinforced. Powder had to be kept safe. Rooms might be adapted for artillery storage or soldiers trained in new weapons. The castle was not dead. It was being asked to become something it had not originally been. Some could answer, others could not. This is the real transition from the medieval castle to the artillery fortress. It was not a clean replacement of old by new, but a long argument between inherited stone and changing violence. Some sites became obsolete, some were transformed. Some became symbolic residences. Some were broken in later wars. Some survived because no one had the money or reason to destroy them. But the meaning of the castle had changed. The wall was no longer the final answer to the attacker's body. It was now one element in a larger technological contest. The fortress had to think like the cannon. It had to absorb, angle, reply, and adapt. The old castle world of towers, keeps, and high curtain walls had entered a new political and military climate. And this brings the story back to the central paradox. Castles had made medieval rulers seem untouchable because they turned power into place. They slowed armies, controlled roads, secured towns, and forced enemies into expensive sieges. But their strength had always depended on systems beyond stone: money, food, loyalty, labor, maintenance, and technology. Gunpowder exposed that dependence in a new way. It showed that no architecture remains powerful simply because it once was. A fortress is only as strong as the world that knows how to use it. When that world changes, the wall must change with it, or become a monument to an older kind of fear. The medieval castle did not vanish from Europe's landscape. It became memory before it became ruin. And in that memory lies the final part of the story. What survived after the castle stopped being the supreme machine of medieval war. The castle died as a weapon long before it died as a symbol. Walk through a ruined castle today, and it is easy to mistake silence for innocence. Grass grows where horses once stamped. Tourists pass through gates that once decided whether men lived or starved. Children climb steps worn by soldiers, servants, prisoners, masons, officials, and lords whose names have vanished from memory. Wind moves through arrow slits that were not designed for beauty. It touches stone that once carried fear, rent, law, hunger, command, and the threat of violence. Time has softened the castle. That is part of its danger as a memory. Because medieval castles were not built as picturesque ruins. They were built to solve hard political problems. How does a conqueror hold hostile land? How does a king project authority beyond his own body? How does a lord dominate a valley, a bridge, a market, a port, or a road. How does a regime make obedience visible when loyalty is uncertain? For centuries, the answer was stone, timber, ditch, gate, garrison, storehouse, and command. The castle changed medieval Europe because it turned power into a place. It made authority local. It allowed a small number of armed men to control movement, shelter officials, store resources, hold prisoners, enforce dues, and wait out enemies who could win in the open but not easily take the walls. This was why castles made kingdoms stronger. They slowed conquest, they secured frontiers, they protected supply points, they made rebellion more difficult when held by the crown. They gave rulers a physical presence in regions where paper authority alone would have been too thin. From the first Norman mots after 1066 to Edward I's great castles in Wales, the fortress became one of the central tools by which victory was converted into rule. But the same tool carried a contradiction from the beginning. A king could not personally hold every gate. He had to trust castellans, sheriffs, nobles, guards, masons, clerks, and suppliers. He had to fund repairs. He had to feed garrisons. He had to keep roads and ports working. He had to make local communities pay enough to maintain order without turning that order into resentment. He had to ensure that the men inside the walls still believed obedience served them better than defection. The castle made royal authority visible, but it also revealed how many hands were needed to keep that authority alive. This is the answer to the central paradox. Castles made kingdoms stronger because they gave rulers durable points of control. They made kings weaker because those points of control could not function without delegation, money, food, loyalty, and local cooperation. The wall looked solid. The system behind it was always human. That is why the story of castles cannot be reduced to architecture. A castle was a military structure, but also a tax office, courthouse, residence, prison, storehouse, refuge, threat, and stage. It protected communities and exploited them. It saved rulers and empowered rebels. It made war harder to win quickly and easier to prolong painfully. It offered safety to some people while making others pay for that safety in labor, grain, coins, and submission. Its meaning changed depending on where one stood. From outside a siege camp, it was an obstacle. From inside the walls, it was a shrinking world of food stores and fear. From a royal archive, it was an asset to be maintained. From a village, it might be a demand arriving on horseback. From a rebel noble's chamber, it was leverage. From a prisoner's locked room, it was the end of movement. The castle gathered all these meanings into one object. That is why it survived so powerfully in imagination after its military supremacy declined. Gunpowder changed the old confidence, but it did not erase the castle from European life. Some fortresses were adapted, some were abandoned, some became aristocratic residences, some became prisons, armories, administrative centers, or symbols of ancient rights. Later warfare developed different forms of fortification, lower and thicker, built for artillery rather than ladders and rams. The castle's military logic changed, but its cultural authority remained. People kept seeing power in the shape of towers. Even when the tower no longer ruled the battlefield as it once had, it still carried memory. Noble families used castles to display lineage. States used old fortresses to hold prisoners or house garrisons. Artists and writers turned ruins into scenes of romance, mystery, and national identity. Modern tourism made castles beautiful again. sometimes by separating them from the systems of coercion that built them. But the stones remember a harsher truth. A ruined gatehouse is not only a scenic entrance, it is the remains of a machine designed to control passage. A keep is not only a dramatic silhouette, it is a structure built to organize hierarchy and resist attack. A curtain wall is not only a line in the landscape, it is the physical edge of a political order that once asked people to obey, because the alternative had become dangerous. This does not mean castles should be remembered only as instruments of oppression. History is rarely that clean. Castles could protect lives. They could stabilize violent regions. They could shelter towns in moments of danger. They could support markets, administration, and roads. They could prevent a raid from becoming a massacre. For many people, a nearby fortress might be resented in peace and desperately needed in war. That ambiguity is part of their power. They were never simply good or evil. They were tools, and like most tools of government, their moral meaning depended on who used them, who paid for them, who was protected by them, and who was trapped beneath them. This is why medieval castles still matter beyond heritage and tourism. They show that power is not only a matter of kings, battles, and laws. It is also a matter of infrastructure. Control needs places. Authority needs storage, roads, records, officers, and guarded thresholds. A ruler's command becomes real only when it can be enforced somewhere by someone against resistance. The medieval castle made that truth visible in stone. And because it was so visible, it is still easier to understand than many modern forms of power. Today, authority often hides inside documents, networks, institutions, screens, databases, contracts, borders, and systems too large or abstract to stand in front of. The castle was more honest. It told the world exactly where command lived. That honesty is why the image remains so strong. A castle on a hill still speaks before anyone explains it. It says that someone once feared attack, expected obedience, controlled labor, collected resources, and believed stone could make their will last longer than their body. Sometimes they were right for centuries. Eventually, they were wrong. Return, then, to the gate at Dover. The king might claim the realm. The prince might claim the throne. The rebels might claim justice. The soldiers might claim duty. But in the practical world of medieval power, the question became simpler and colder. Who held the gate? Who had food inside? Who could endure? And who would open when pressure became too much? That was the castle's world, a world where war became slower, rule became heavier, and loyalty became something that could be locked, supplied, taxed, starved, negotiated, or betrayed. The Middle Ages did not build castles because people loved fairy tale towers. They built them because land was dangerous, authority was fragile, and violence needed architecture. The ruins remain because the buildings were strong. The lesson remains because the system was never as solid as the walls made it appear. If this story leaves anything behind, it is not just the image of stone against the sky. It is the knowledge that every structure of power, no matter how permanent it looks, depends on human obedience inside it. And when that obedience fails, even the strongest gate is only waiting to be opened. If you want the next chapter in this series, tell us which medieval system should face the same kind of autopsy next. The battlefield, the church, the knightly order, the royal court, or the city walls that once made Europe feel impossible to conquer. The castle did not disappear. It was absorbed by the state. By the end of the medieval world, the old fortress had lost much of its certainty. High walls still stood, gatehouses still cast shadows over roads, towers still marked the skyline of towns and valleys. But the political and military world around them had changed. Gunpowder artillery had forced engineers to rethink the shape of defense. Royal governments had grown more ambitious. Warfare had become more expensive, more technical, and increasingly dependent on centralized finance. The castle remained visible. Its old world was fading. This did not happen in one clean moment. There was no single year when the castle ceased to matter. Some castles remained useful as military posts. Others became residences, prisons, storehouses, armories, or administrative centers. Some were modernized with gunports and earthworks. Some were neglected because the money required to adapt them could not be justified. Others were deliberately damaged after civil conflict, so they could no longer serve as rebel strongholds. The transformation was uneven because history usually is. A fortress in a wealthy kingdom with strategic importance might be adapted. A remote private stronghold might decline slowly. A castle near a border, port, or rebellious region might retain value longer than one in a pacified interior. Geography, politics, money, and war decided the pace of change more than any simple theory of technology. But the direction was clear. The medieval castle had belonged to a world where local lordship and fortified residence were deeply connected. A great noble might dominate a district from his own walls. A rebel might survive because he controlled a stronghold. A king had to worry not only about foreign enemies, but about the castles inside his own realm. As states became more centralized, that world became harder to tolerate. Rulers wanted the monopoly of serious violence. They wanted artillery, taxes, royal armies, appointed officials, controlled arsenals, regulated fortifications, and fewer private centers of military independence. The castle had once helped kings project authority into the countryside. Later, too many independent castles could look like a problem that stronger monarchy needed to solve. This changed the meaning of fortification. Defense did not end. It became more specialized. The vertical drama of the medieval keep gave way, in many places, to lower, thicker, more geometric forms designed to face cannon. Bastions, angled walls, earth banks, artillery platforms, and planned military engineering began to replace the older language of towers and curtain walls. The fortress became less like a lord's residence and more like a technical instrument of the state. A medieval castle had often combined many roles in one place: home, court, prison, storehouse, barracks, symbol, and refuge. The new military fortress narrowed the function. It was more professional, more mathematical, more closely tied to state finance and military planning. Its strength came not from a noble family's local dominance, but from engineers, artillery, trained garrisons, supply systems, and central command. The old castle had made lordship visible. The new fortress made state capacity visible. For ordinary people, the change was not necessarily liberation. The decline of the private castle did not mean the decline of coercion. It meant coercion changed shape. Instead of a local lord's tower dominating a valley, a royal fortress might guard a border. Instead of a baron's private prison, a state prison might hold political enemies. Instead of labor owed to a nearby castle, taxes might flow into national wars fought far away. Power moved upward. It became less personal in some places, but not less demanding. A peasant or townsman who once feared the Lord's gate might now feel the pressure of royal taxation, conscription, customs duties, road controls, military requisition, or the presence of soldiers serving a wider state. The face of authority changed. The need to supply it did not vanish. This is why the castle's afterlife matters. It shows that the end of one structure of power often becomes the beginning of another. When castles stopped being the supreme machines of medieval war, the habits they had helped create did not disappear. Governments still needed fortified points. They still needed records, stores, prisons, roads, gates, and armed men. They still needed to turn territory into something enforceable. The tools changed, the problem remained. In some places, old castles became symbols of noble memory. Families converted defensive spaces into more comfortable residences. Windows widened. Halls became more domestic. Gardens appeared where military urgency had once ruled. A tower that had once been built to watch for enemies might become a sign of ancestry, taste, or prestige. Yet even this softer transformation carried politics. To live in a castle or in a house built from castle remains was to claim continuity with an older order. Stone gave families a history they could display. A ruin could become proof of ancient importance. A restored hall could suggest that the family inside had always belonged above others. Military function declined, but social meaning survived. In other places, castles became prisons. This was not accidental. Thick walls controlled entrances, isolated chambers, and existing authority made them useful for confinement. A structure built to keep enemies out could easily be used to keep captives in. The logic reversed, but the architecture remained suitable. Political prisoners, debtors, rebels, or ordinary offenders could all be absorbed into spaces originally designed for a different kind of insecurity. Some castles became administrative shells. Officials used old fortified sites because they already stood at important points. Towns, crossings, ports, borders, and former centers of lordship. Even when the military role weakened, the location could remain useful. A castle that had once controlled a market might still sit near the same market. A fortress that had guarded a road might still matter because the road still carried people, goods, and messages. The stone survived because geography survived. Not every castle found a new role. Many decayed. Roofs failed. Timber rotted. Lead was stripped. Stones were reused in houses, walls, roads, and farm buildings. Local people sometimes treated ruins as quarries because the political system that once protected the structure no longer cared enough to maintain it. A castle could dominate a region for centuries, then slowly become useful as building material. This slow decay has its own historical meaning. It reminds us that power does not always end in flames. Sometimes it ends through maintenance not performed. A wall is not defeated by an army. A roof is not repaired. A gatehouse is not guarded. A tower becomes unsafe. Grass enters the courtyard. The fortress remains on the hill, but its role in the living system has ended. That kind of ending is quieter than siege. It is also more common. When modern people visit castles, they often encounter this softened afterlife first. Ruins are framed by grass, tickets, guidebooks, photographs, school trips, and dramatic skies. The violence has been translated into heritage. The tax demands, fear, hunger, and forced labor are harder to see than the skyline. But a serious look at castles should restore that lost weight. The ruins are not false. They are incomplete. They show what stone endured, not everything stone required. They show walls without the grain carts, towers without the wages, gates without the argument over who controlled them, halls without the disputes and punishments that gave them meaning. To understand a castle, one has to imagine the system around it moving again. The road below fills with carts. A messenger arrives with sealed instructions. A constable argues over repairs. A servant carries water up narrow stairs. A prisoner waits behind a locked door. A mason checks damaged stone. A clerk records payments. A guard watches the road, not because it is beautiful, but because danger and authority both travel along it. Then the ruin becomes less romantic and more honest. It becomes evidence. Evidence that medieval power needed architecture. Evidence that war could be slowed by stone, but not solved by it. Evidence that kings depended on people who were not kings. Evidence that the strongest structures still required food, labor, trust, and money. Evidence that political systems often look most permanent just before another kind of system begins to replace them. The castle's afterlife also shaped storytelling. Later generations turned castles into settings for romance, horror, children's fantasy, aristocratic nostalgia, and historical drama. This was not surprising. Castles are visually perfect memory machines. They offer darkness, height, secrecy, imprisonment, inheritance, danger, and lost grandeur. They make the past feel solid enough to enter. But those stories often remove the administrative machinery. They remember the night, but not the tax record. They remember the tower, but not the laborer dragging timber through mud. They remember the princess in the chamber, but not the servant carrying ashes down the stair. They remember the siege engine, but not the village stripped for food to feed the besieging army. A better history restores the missing people, not to destroy the castle's fascination, but to deepen it. A castle is more interesting when it is not only beautiful. It is more powerful when its beauty is allowed to be uncomfortable. The stone looks different when we remember that it protected and threatened, sheltered and extracted, impressed and imprisoned. Its survival as an image should not erase its function as a machine of rule. That is why the medieval castle still speaks across time. It reminds us that every age builds structures that seem natural while they are working. Fortresses, courts, borders, archives, databases, ministries, military bases, financial systems. Each can make authority feel ordinary. Each can turn decisions made far away into daily pressure for people below. Each can look permanent until the assumptions behind it change. The castle is simply the version we can still touch. Stone makes the lesson easier to see. A high wall once told villagers that power had arrived and intended to stay. A locked gate told enemies that violence would have to pay a price. A keep told rivals that the lord inside had resources, men, and time. A castle town told a conquered region that administration had followed the army. Later, artillery, central states, changing economies, and new forms of military engineering altered the old equation. But the deeper pattern remained. Rulers still searched for ways to make authority durable, local, and enforceable. The castle was one answer, not the first, not the last, but for the medieval world it was one of the most visible, and perhaps that is why the ruins endure so strongly in imagination. They show both confidence and failure in the same object. The builders believed the walls would matter. They were right. They believed stone could preserve a certain kind of order. For a time it did. They could not know all the worlds that would come after. Cannon smoke, centralized states, tourists with cameras, children running through chambers where armed men once waited for orders. The stones outlived the system, but they did not outlive meaning. They remain as reminders that power is never only held in titles, laws, or crowns. It is held in places, in routines, in supplies, in people willing to guard the door, in records that say who owes what, and in the quiet assumption that the structure will still be there tomorrow. Medieval castles once made that assumption visible from miles away. Their ruins still do. A ruin is never empty when people still need it to mean something. Long after castles lost their old military certainty, they gained another kind of power. They became stories. Not immediately, and not in the same way everywhere. Some castles remained practical buildings for a long time. Prisons, barracks, storehouses, residences, administrative centers, or local landmarks used because they were already there. But as the medieval military system faded, the castle began to drift into imagination. Its walls no longer only controlled roads and valleys, they began to control memory. This transformation matters because memory can be as selective as conquest. The medieval castle had been a hard object of rule. It collected dues, held prisoners, guarded stores, sheltered soldiers, and made local authority visible. But later generations often remembered it differently. They saw romance, mystery, family lineage, national endurance, tragic imprisonment, lost nobility, or ancient identity. The working machine became a stage. A tower that once intimidated villagers could become a symbol of regional pride. A keep that once housed armed men could become a backdrop for legend. A ruin that once marked coercion could become a destination for painters, poets, schoolchildren, tourists, and filmmakers. The same stones remained, but the emotional contract changed. This was not simply ignorance. People often use the past to answer needs in the present. A nation looking for ancient roots may turn castles into proof of continuity. A noble family may treat a crumbling tower as evidence of inherited importance. A town may convert a former stronghold into a civic symbol. A tourist economy may sell beauty where earlier people experienced fear, labor, taxation, or confinement. The castle adapts because it is visually persuasive. Few structures carry so many meanings at once. A castle can suggest safety and imprisonment, nobility and violence, childhood fantasy and adult politics, lost worlds and surviving authority. Its shape is simple enough to recognize instantly, but complex enough to absorb new stories. Towers, gates, walls, chambers, staircases, dungeons, banners, and ruins give imagination plenty of places to hide. This is why the castle became one of the most durable images of the Middle Ages. For many modern viewers, the castle comes before the archive. Before tax records, before legal disputes, before land grants, siege accounts, wage rolls, building orders, and political negotiations. The image arrives first. A tower on a hill, mist around the walls, a gate half open, a banner moving in wind. That image is powerful. It is also incomplete. A castle without its records becomes too clean. A castle without its laborers becomes too noble. A castle without its prisoners becomes too romantic. A castle without its tax collectors becomes too harmless. To understand the real medieval fortress, the image has to be put back into motion. The road must fill again. A cart brings grain. A messenger carries orders. A mason checks damage after winter. A constable argues over unpaid wages. A prisoner hears footsteps outside the chamber. A village sends labor because refusal carries consequences. A garrison eats through stores while waiting for a threat that may not arrive. These are not decorative details, they are the life of the system. Still, myth does not appear from nowhere. Castles became mythic because they were already theatrical in their own time. Medieval rulers built them not only to function, but to be seen. A castle above a town was meant to create an emotional reaction. It was supposed to feel larger than the individuals who operated it. It was supposed to make authority appear settled into the landscape. Later myth simply inherited that visual power and changed the message. The same height that once warned villagers could inspire painters. The same walls that once separated lord from tenant could become symbols of shared heritage. The same ruin that once represented a dead aristocratic order could become a national monument. Memory did not erase the castle's authority, it translated it. That translation often softened violence. The siege became adventure, the lord became a character, the prisoner became a legend, the battlement became scenery. The labor behind construction disappeared into the phrase, "they built." But they were never abstract. Men quarried stone, laborers hauled timber, animals dragged carts, officials counted supplies. Women cooked, washed, waited, carried, served, endured. Local communities paid in ways chronicles often barely noticed. A more honest castle story gives those people back their weight, not by stripping away atmosphere, but by making atmosphere sharper. A candlelit hall is more interesting when we know who was allowed to sit near the fire and who remained outside the door. A tower is more powerful when we remember that height was a social language. A gate is more dramatic when we understand that it controlled food, movement, surrender, and survival. The fantasy castle and the historical castle do not have to be enemies, but they should not be confused. Fantasy often gives castles emotional clarity. Good kings, evil lords, hidden heirs, secret chambers, ancient curses, noble quests. History gives them friction. Ambiguous loyalties, expensive repairs, conflicting claims, hungry soldiers, legal disputes, forced labor, practical decisions made by people who rarely knew how their choices would be judged later. The real castle is darker because it is less simple. It can protect a town and exploit it in the same decade. It can shelter refugees and imprison enemies. It can symbolize order and provoke rebellion. It can be beautiful because of the same design choices that once made it intimidating. It can outlive the people who built it and then serve stories they would not recognize. This complexity is why castles remain useful for historical documentary. They allow the viewer to see systems that are otherwise abstract. Feudal obligation becomes a gate, taxation becomes a storehouse, delegated authority becomes a castellan. Conquest becomes a new wall rising in a familiar landscape. Siege warfare becomes a kitchen rationing grain. Gunpowder transformation becomes a cracked tower and an engineer measuring angles. The castle turns power into something visible. That visibility also explains why rulers after the Middle Ages continued to use castle imagery even when the military logic had changed. A ruler standing before ancient walls borrowed their age. A nation preserving a fortress borrowed its endurance. A family restoring a tower borrowed its ancestral weight. Even a modern logo, film, or theme park castle borrows the same emotional grammar. Safety, wonder, hierarchy, threshold, and command. The castle became shorthand for a world people think they understand. But the real medieval world was not a fairy tale map. It was a world of uncertain communication, local violence, seasonal campaigning, personal lordship, religious obligation, fragile administration, and slow travel. In that world, a castle was not nostalgia. It was infrastructure. That is the difference the script must keep alive. When the camera moves across a ruined battlement, the narration should not only say that the place is old. It should ask what the wall once did. Whose movement did it control? Whose taxes repaired it? Whose fear made it necessary? Whose ambition made it larger than necessity? Whose loyalty kept it from falling? Those questions return the castle from myth to history. They do not make the ruin less cinematic. They make it more dangerous. A purely romantic castle is beautiful but thin. A historical castle is heavier. It carries weather, debt, hunger, rank, silence, pride, and violence inside the same stones. It asks the viewer to admire the architecture without forgetting the system that gave it purpose. That is the balance this documentary should preserve. The castle should look magnificent, but never innocent. It should feel ancient, but never vague. Its towers should carry atmosphere, but every atmosphere should be grounded in mechanism. Conquest, administration, siege, taxation, loyalty, gunpowder, memory. By the end, the viewer should no longer see a castle as only a medieval building. They should see it as an argument in stone. An argument that rulers made against disorder, that conquerors made against resistance, that nobles made against royal control, that states later absorbed, modified, abandoned, and remembered. That modern imagination softened into romance because the original machine became too distant to hurt us directly. But distance is not the same as innocence. A castle ruin is quiet because the people who suffered under its system are gone. The records are scattered. The wood has rotted. The banners have vanished. The kitchens are cold. The garrison no longer eats. The gate no longer decides who may pass. Yet the image remains. That image is why castles still work on us. They offer the illusion of a past that can be entered through a gate. But the real past does not open that easily. It asks for more than admiration. It asks for reconstruction of labor, fear, command, survival, and the choices that made stone necessary. Only then does the castle become fully visible, not as fantasy, not as ruin, not as postcard, but as one of the clearest machines the medieval world ever built for turning violence into order, and order back into memory.